Tenakoto, tenakoto, tenakoto katoa. Distinguished guests, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and a very warm welcome to Victoria University of Wellington. I'm Manjeet Pardesi, the Acting Director of the Center for Strategic Studies. Welcome to our panel discussion with three visiting speakers from the National Bureau of Asian Research in Seattle and Washington, D.C. on the U.S. China strategic competition. All three of our speakers are involved with NBR's Strategic Asia program, which puts out an excellent publication on geopolitical issues in Asia. Our distinguished NBR speakers include Michael Wiltz, sitting in the center, the Executive Vice President of NBR. Michael manages NBR's publication program, including the Strategic Asia series and the Asia Policy Journal. His research expertise includes geopolitics, international security, and international relations of Asia, with a particular interest in China's relations with Southeast Asia. To his right is Alison Szalwinski, Vice President of Research. Alison's research interests include U.S. policy towards Asia, especially U.S. China relations and great power competition in the region. She's the author of numerous articles and reports on these issues and co-editor of the Strategic Asia series. And finally, we have Anne-Marie Murphy, Professor Seton Hall University. Anne's research publications have focused on Indonesian elections, foreign policy, military strategy, socio-political transformation and engagement with the US, as well as engagement with East Asian regionalism and the role of Muslim professional associations in Southeast Asian politics. Let me say by noting that we are absolutely delighted to have such a fantastic panel lined up this evening. Many thanks to Michael O'Shaughnessy from the Americas Division at MFAT for facilitating this event. Also many thanks to Sue Rogers, the CSS administrator, for putting this event together, including the reception outside afterwards. So our panel discussion this evening will focus on the US-China competition for influence in Asia and globally. Our American speakers will talk to us for about 10 minutes or so on their areas of expertise, and we will open the floor to questions and discussions afterwards. So we will begin with Michael.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here at the university today. We really appreciate the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade for helping bring us to Wellington and the opportunity to have this discussion here. As Manjeet said, Ali and I work for NBR, the National Bureau of Asian Research. We're an independent policy research institution, a think tank, based in both Seattle and Washington, D.C. We're not part of the US government, but for 30 years we've worked with different administrations and different congresses to inform and strengthen policy. Our mission is to bring the best possible expertise from the academic community to bear on US policy thinking in the hopes that our policymakers will make better informed decisions. Increasingly, we're having conversations across the region too. We focus only on the Asia-Pacific region, and so we have conversations with policymakers in Tokyo and in Seoul and in Taipei. This past week we were in Canberra and Sydney, and this week we're having some meetings here with government officials in Wellington. One distinguishing characteristic of NBR is that we are a think tank that works on a network of experts model. We engage thousands of professors from universities around the world on our research projects. And in any one year, we might have 150 to 200 professors working on NBR research. That means we're getting a breadth of opinions and perspectives into our work, and we're using those to inform the US policy community. One of our core programs at NBR is the Strategic Asia program. This is an annual assessment of the changing balance of power across the Asia-Pacific region, about geopolitical trends in the region. And the last two books that we published in January of 2019 and then January of 2020 have been exploring the question of the increasingly tense competition between the United States and China. And so what I'm going to do in my remarks is just spend a few minutes describing that from the US perspective, and then I'll turn it over to Alison to talk about how the region's responding. And then Anne-Marie will do a deeper dive into Southeast Asia. But we look forward to your questions and comments following our remarks. So to begin with, I want to talk about China's rise as a story, and it's a fascinating one. It's one we're all very familiar with, and for 40 years it's turned China from a country that was emerging from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution to a great global power. And our experts view this rise taking place in 3 phases. The first phase under Deng Xiaoping is a period of sort of internal consolidation and a focus on growing China's national power. Deng, when he took over in 1978, 1979, began China's 4 modernizations to transform the country from an agrarian economy into an industrial powerhouse, and then increasingly into an information-based economy that we see today. And this required China to have a peaceful environment outside its borders. In order to focus internally on this task of national rejuvenation, Deng required there to be a peaceful international environment. And so the maxim that many of you will be familiar with is sort of hide capabilities and bide time. You know, China wanted to grow its power without causing any problems with the rest of the world. This period lasted really until 1991. And so following the end of the Cold War, China's environment changed quite dramatically, and the new Chinese leadership under Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao began a more focused effort to increase their economic liberalization, to integrate China into the global economy. And this culminated in 2001 with China's accession into the WTO. And during this period, Western businesses, US businesses were increasingly involved in China. This was sort of a win-win period. There was a lot of cooperative talk between the 2 countries. Yet at the same time, there were some security dilemmas between the United States and China. We see this in 1996 during the Taiwan Strait crisis, when during the Taiwanese presidential election, China threatened the island, and the US sent aircraft carrier battle groups between the mainland and Taiwan. We see it again at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration in 2001 with the EP3 incident. And both of these, I think, reflect a Chinese desire, even back during this sort of end of the hide and bide era, to push back against US power. China did not feel comfortable with a strong United States operating right around its periphery. And so Beijing was looking for ways to kind of push US forces and US presence further away from its shores and have more of a buffer zone around it. And then the third phase really begins in 2008. And this is following the great global financial crisis, the recession that hit the United States and it hit Europe. And this was seen as an opportunity by Hu Jintao and the Chinese administration at that point as a sign that the Western model of a sort of free market, liberalized, globalized economic and political system was beginning to fail. The fact that the West was not able to respond quickly to this crisis, and the fact that China was sort of able to sidestep it, led to, I think, decisions in Beijing or conclusions in Beijing that this was China's time. And that now was the opportunity for China to really assert itself as a great power on the world stage. We see this markedly begin after 2012, although the antecedents precede it. Xi Jinping, once he took power, really began to consolidate the power of the party state. The anti-corruption campaign sidelined a lot of internal rivals, and we moved towards a Chinese system that looked much more like the Mao era, where power was consolidated into the hands of one man, as opposed to the more technocratic leadership that we'd seen during the previous Chinese presidents. In 2013, China begins the Belt and Road Initiative with much fanfare and sort of very ambitious plan to connect China globally through Central Asia, through South and Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean, through the Middle East, into Eastern Europe, and increasingly in the region that New Zealand's concerned about, through Southeast Asia and into the Pacific Island states. And in some cases, US analysts would even view it as hitting the Western Hemisphere with Chinese investments in Central and South America. In 2014, she, I think, makes an even bolder move, which is a speech in which she launches what we call the Asian security concept. And this is the idea that according to Xi, that Asia's security affairs should be handled by and managed by Asians alone without outside interference. And the implication is that the US, as the big outside power, is the one that really should step back from the region. And accompanying all of this is a fairly dramatic military modernization program. The People's Liberation Army has transformed enormously over this 40-year period. And then recently under Xi Jinping has restructured itself to be more outward-oriented. So instead of, is it 7 military regions, I think? We went from 7 military regions which were defensive within China's territory to 5 military theater commands, where China was beginning to think from a military perspective in similar ways to the United States military, where you're looking at joint operations between the services, both defensive, but also the ability to operate in regions around China, including maritime areas far beyond China's shores. And so the first thing I'd leave you with is that there's been this long rise of Chinese power that is increasingly affecting the region and the world, the international system more broadly. The second point I'd make is just to dig into the regional ambitions of China a little bit. And I'll focus briefly on both Northeast Asia and very briefly on Southeast Asia, but I'm going to let Anne-Marie focus on that in her remarks. And what we see really here are sort of 2 elements of Chinese ambitions. China's been trying, on the one hand, to weaken US security alliances around the region. And so putting pressure on allies like Japan, on South Korea, on Taiwan. Taiwan is not an ally, but it's a security partner of the United States. To be more deferential to China's interests and less willing to support US security moves or military moves in the region. And really, this is trying to kind of pull allies out of the US orbit and into more of a Chinese orbit. In economic terms, the trend that's happened over this decades-long period is that China's trade ties with many countries in the region and China's investment links with many countries in the region have grown significantly. And Beijing has been quite willing to use that leverage to pursue its interests. And so we see this, for example, in South Korea. So when South Korea's government decided to deploy, or let the US deploy THAAD missile defense systems on South Korean territory, China dissuaded Chinese tourists from traveling to South Korea in large numbers, which had fairly significant effects on South Korea's economy. And so we're beginning to see China, with its newfound power, exert that leverage in order to get the outcomes that it wants to see across the region. In Taiwan, it's even more extreme. China has a goal to reunify and to bring the island into Chinese territory. And so for many years now, China has pursued a strategy of very strong diplomatic isolation against Taiwan, closing down Taiwan's diplomatic space and role in international organizations, peeling away the few countries that still recognize Taiwan and encouraging them to transfer their allegiance to Beijing. And more recently, drastically increasing Chinese influence operations within Taiwanese society and within Taiwanese politics. And so this was a very real concern for both of the last 2 presidential election cycles in the island. And China has set a goal, Xi Jinping has set a goal that really by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, China will have emerged as a great global power. The unstated implication is that reunification will have happened by that point. And so there's a narrowing window where Beijing is really going to increase the pressure on Taiwan. We see very similar trends playing out beyond Northeast Asia, through South Asia, through Southeast Asia, through Central Asia. Most markedly, I think, in Southeast Asia, I'll just make one remark there, and that's the militarization of the South China Sea, the building of islands across the South China Sea, very aggressive territorial claims that have challenged the claims of ASEAN countries in that region, and essentially an attempt to weaken ASEAN's response by building very strong relationships with a few ASEAN countries to prevent the organization from fulfilling what it's traditionally done, which is collective responses to problems. And so if we think about China's rise and we think about China's ambitions in its region, the third and final thing I'd want to leave you with is then how does this look from the perspective of the United States, which has been for 60 to 70 years now the regional security guarantor in the region. And the United States views China's behavior as fairly threatening because China's really working against the interests of US allies and putting pressure on them, and the US as an alliance partner feels the need to respond to that. But China's behavior is also affecting US national interests directly. The United States has not been an Asian power purely since 1945. I mean, it's had ambitions in the region going back a century or more. And so from the perspective of US policymakers and US national security managers, China's behavior in recent years has been seen as quite threatening, and it's prompting responses. And you see this obviously under the Trump administration with a much harsher tone of rhetoric toward China, national security strategies that talk about the return of great power competition in the region. And what I finish my remarks with is a point that this is not just a US government response. There are three additional trends within America that have led the US towards this more competitive posture. The first is a trend within the business community. For most of the 1990s, US businesses were lobbying for WTO accession because they saw the commercial opportunities that engagement with China would afford. Post-WTO accession in 2001, again, US businesses were strong champions of a positive relationship with China. But if you look back over the last 5, 6, 7 years, the annual surveys that the American Chamber of Commerce runs in China have shown decreasing business confidence in China, partly because of increased restrictions that the Chinese government has put on foreign businesses operating in China. Partly it's because of aggressive Chinese behavior in terms of IP theft and other issues that have damaged the ability for US companies to continue to pursue their goals. And so there's been a process in the last few years where it varies company by company and sector by sector, but that broad support from the business community for a strong and cooperative relationship with China has been declining. The second trend is a wider one within the US population post-financial crisis since 2008. And the Trump campaign was able in 2016 to really leverage this and sort of use it to secure power in the election. So many parts of the US population felt that they had lost out during the financial crisis, and that globalization as a whole had not been a benefit for them. There were industries in decline. China was seen as the reason for this in many ways, and the Trump campaign very skillfully linked this discontent with globalization and economic liberalization with the rise of China. And so this second trend, I think, has led to a hardening of popular attitudes toward China. And then more recently, in the last couple of years, we've seen a series of Chinese actions in, say, Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, that have led to an increased concern amongst parts of the US public and the human rights community that China's behavior is really not acceptable. It's counter to international norms. And so these three things are leading to sort of reinforce this idea of the fact that we're now in a more competitive relationship. So I'll conclude my remarks by just noting that our analysts, both from the Strategic Asia Program and other MBR projects, feel that this is a competition that is it's going to be enduring. This is not something that will just be during the Trump administration and that will somehow spring back to the situation pre-2016 following a new administration coming in, whether that's later this year or 4 years from now. But that there are deep structural reasons why the United States and China are entering a more competitive relationship, and that competition will really define and determine the course of international politics for several decades to come.
Thank you, Mike.
Great. Thanks. Michael has teed me up wonderfully. As the first few lines of my remarks, what I want to share pretty much echo what he concluded with, and that is that the strategic drivers behind Chinese policy and US policy that are influencing decision makers are very deeply rooted. And I'm sure some of you may have followed. Earlier this year, the US and China signed a phase 1 trade deal that many people were looking to as a sign that perhaps the intensity of the competition would reduce, or things would maybe revert to a status quo. But I think what Michael has kind of shared here should illustrate that, that this is especially within the US policy community, but also within China, a culmination of decades-long intensification in bilateral relations, where we've seen intensification on a range of issues from trade, ongoing trade war, to contested interpretations of the Belt and Road Initiative, and other Chinese activities, as Michael noted, that suggest a desire to change the international order. So he's talked a little bit about the US and China, but it's also critical to take a look at other states both in the region and around the globe, who are realizing and responding to the reality that the US-China competition will define the international system in the decades to come. Over the past few years, many countries have been grappling with the short-term, immediate impacts of US-China competition. Much of this has been felt in the US-China trade war, as supply chains are shifting, and some countries have to make decisions regarding deployment of 5G networks. But simultaneously, the long-term and multidimensional nature of the competition has become more apparent and unavoidable. As it does, countries and regions are attempting to respond, falling along what I see as a spectrum of responses. On one end of that spectrum, you have states that are seeking to just avoid negative impacts that might result from this competition. And in the middle, you have some states that are positioning themselves between the two powers to protect their own interests. And then, of course, at the other extreme, there are some nations that are looking to exploit the competition to advance their own interests and see advantages to be had within the competition. So if we look geographically closest to the competition itself, of course, the Indo-Pacific region bears the brunt. The region is confronting an old but increasingly high-stakes dilemma, and one that will be familiar to you all. States are geographically stuck with China, and they're economically interdependent on Chinese markets. But most of them are reliant on US power for security and regional stability. Of the states in the Indo-Pacific, some, including those such as Japan, Taiwan, India, and Australia, share US strategic interests in checking Chinese expanding regional influence. But they are simultaneously navigating the economic ties with China amid concerns over US reliability. So of these states, I'll just pick on Japan for a second as an example, because it stands as one of the states that's most closely aligned with US objectives towards China. Japanese policymakers welcomed the fact that the United States now takes China's rise seriously as a strategic challenge. They've responded by beefing up their own military capabilities, more resolutely resisting Chinese claims over disputed island territories, tightening their security cooperation with the United States, strengthening partnerships with other regional powers such as India and Australia, offering various Indo-Pacific nations alternate possibilities to China's BRI investments, and even diversifying Japanese economic investments away from China to the degree possible. But despite that, Japan cannot pursue any comprehensive economic decoupling from China. Instead, it sought to limit tensions at a time of increased concerns about US reliability and pressures from the Trump administration for greater burden sharing and more trade concessions. Meanwhile, other countries in the region, such as Central Asia and the Pacific Islands, face a different set of challenges. They share less of an interest in countering Chinese influence and instead seek to take advantage of benefits to their own interests of the increasing attention by the two major powers. In the Pacific Islands, many states have sought to thread the needle on engaging with the United States, Australia, New Zealand on the one hand, and China on the other, finding opportunities to benefit from development and capacity building that both groups are offering. With the increased attention, the Pacific Island countries have looked for ways to further their own national interests and their own narratives on non-traditional security issues, including combating climate change. They've forcefully grounded their own non-traditional security agenda through the Blue Pacific narrative and the Boe Declaration as a direct pushback against the geopolitical agenda of these metropolitan powers. So that's the Indo-Pacific region, but the competition has effects and it reaches well beyond the region itself. Russia, the post-Soviet states, Canada, Mexico, Latin America, and South America, nations throughout Europe are all being shaped by and responding to the reverberations of the rivalry. Although they are all driven by different interests and variables, like the countries in the Indo-Pacific, responses to the competition are arrayed along a spectrum, from those that view the competition as an opportunity to those who are primarily focused on avoiding becoming inadvertent victims. Russia is one that seeks to exploit the U.S. China competition to gain advantages in its own rivalry with the United States. Moscow hopes the U.S. competition with China will distract the United States from countering Russian objectives in Central Asia and weaken its primary geopolitical rival. More than any other state, Russia has increased its cooperation with China on all fronts, conducting joint military exercises, increasing political cooperation, and coordinating to establish norms in international organizations. In a different way, though, parts of Eastern Europe are also looking to gain some benefits from the Sino-US rivalry by leveraging the attention that China and the United States are paying them. As smaller states, they remain cautious about the potential to become a target caught between the two powers, but they don't want to miss an opportunity for significant development. Countries like Ukraine and Georgia, while aware that their best defense against Russian incursion is a security relationship with the United States, see great potential in the economic promise of Chinese investment. Meanwhile, nations in Western Europe and North America are facing pressure from the United States to support US policy positions on issues such as Huawei, while balancing the economic and political cost of doing so. In the United States' own hemisphere, neighbors Canada and Mexico have both found themselves in a difficult position over the past few years. Canada continues to deal with diplomatic and economic blowback from arresting Huawei chief financial officer Meng Wanzhou under its extradition treaty with the United States, while Mexico faces challenging headwinds in its automobile and transportation sectors in the aftermath of the passage of the U.S. Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. So, out of all of these examples, there are two broad messages that are ring true for all states across the Indo-Pacific, outside of the region, globally, states that are close U.S. allies, as well as more distant partners. The first is that all of these states are navigating the challenges of economic interdependence. They're looking for ways to maximize their security interests without sacrificing their economic relationship with China. And this is true even for the United States. As the US continues to develop the contours of its strategy towards China in an era of increasing competition, the United States is still trying to figure out how itself navigates this world of economic interdependence. And the second message that all states want the United States, and to a certain degree China, to hear is, don't make us choose. If the US is to be successful, and that's the perspective that we often come from at NBR, it should not force a choice between the US or China. It should instead help empower states politically to deal with Beijing's increasing influence across the region and across the globe. So I'll leave it here and turn it over to my colleague Anne-Marie to go a little bit further into the case for Southeast Asia.
Well, thank you very much, Ali, and thank all of you for coming out. So what I want to do today is just briefly talk about how Sino-US competition is perceived in Southeast Asia. I see a lot of students here, so if you've read your IR literature, you will know that for small and medium-sized states like those in Southeast Asia, the most benign international environment is one of great power equilibrium, right? A rough balance of power, because that creates opportunities for small and medium powers to secure economic and political benefits from all sides. In contrast, the most dangerous international environment for small and medium states is one of zero-sum competition, because it forces states, as Ali notes, to choose sides. This is the environment that Southeast Asian countries faced in the Cold War, the Vietnam War, which many of them remember as a particularly dangerous and costly time for them. And it's the way in which they increasingly perceive Sino-American rivalry. No Southeast Asian state wants to face a binary choice between Washington or Beijing, but increasingly they believe that they do. So what I want to do, since Michael laid out very clearly kind of China's rise, I just want to say a few words about what Southeast Asia wants, and then focus a bit on how it has perceived changes in U.S. policy over time. So from the perspective of Southeast Asia, what do they want from China? They want economic opportunities, and they wanted to see a peaceful rise. And they got this until about a decade ago, as Michael noted, right? The Chinese economy grew, creating opportunities for trade and investment. They saw China become an international aid supporter during the Asian financial crisis, when it joined IMF bailouts of Southeast Asian countries for the first time in 2008. As Michael noted, the Chinese economy really pulled the global economy, and particularly Southeast Asian countries, out of the crisis. China very eagerly joined ASEAN-based architecture, joining the EAS, the East Asian Economic Summit, et cetera. And that gave rise and hopes among Southeast Asian countries that they could enmesh China in ASEAN-based organizations and convince China that it was in its interest to rise peacefully and to abide by ASEAN norms of the peaceful settlement of disputes, non-interference in domestic affairs, and life would go on happily. And then about a decade ago, 2009, we see China take a series of steps that indicated that it was, as Michael noted, willing to abandon its kind of bide your time, hide your strength policy of Deng Xiaoping. 2009, as you all know, China unveils its 9-dash line map, which claims 90% of the South China Sea and causes territorial disputes with Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, etc. 2012, it used military force to seize Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. 2014, it places an oil rig in waters disputed with Vietnam that lie well within Vietnam's EEZ, and it engaged in physical clashes to protect that. China failed to participate in and abide by the 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration of the UN Law of the Sea, which ruled on behalf of a claim brought by the Philippines that China's 9-dash line map was inconsistent with UNCLOS and therefore illegal. And then, as we've heard, China built and then militarized a whole series of islands in the South China Sea, which have now given it power projection capability much closer to Southeast Asia. So in short, we see a huge increase in threat on the part of China over the last decade. So if we now turn to the U.S., we see that the fundamental concern of the part of Southeast Asian states since the Vietnam War has been of U.S. commitment to the region. And if we look at Obama's pivot or rebalance to Asia, which was announced in 2011, we see that this policy was designed to enhance confidence among many countries, but particularly Southeast Asians, that the U.S. was a reliable security partner. And the pivot was multifaceted, designed to address another concern among Southeast Asian countries, which is that U.S. policy towards the region tends to focus on security at the expense of economics, which of course are vitally important to the developing countries of the region. So yes, the pivot had a security component of moving 60% of the Navy over, of enhancing alliances and partnerships. But it also had an economic component, the TPP, a very high quality free trade agreement, and it had a multilateral component. The US under Obama embraced ASEAN-led architecture. It signs the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in 2012. It joined the East Asian Summit. The U.S. was the first country to appoint a resident ambassador to ASEAN, and Obama backed up his policy with the most precious commodity any president has, his time. He attended 7 of the EAS meetings during his tenure in office. And the Southeast Asian countries welcomed the U.S. pivot, even if they later might not have believed that it lived up to all of its hype, because it evidenced a commitment, it had an economic component, and it demonstrated a U.S. willingness to play its traditional offshore balancing role that gives smaller states greater strategic options. So, what do we see under Trump? We see a very transactional America First policy. In economics, as you all know, he withdraws from the TPP in one of his first acts as president. I cannot overstate how much of a blow this was to many economic reformers in countries like Vietnam and Malaysia that had invested significant political capital in generating support for the TPP. Trump then, as you all know, declares a trade war with China, which has disrupted global supply chains and lowered growth forecasts in many Southeast Asian countries. He's taken a very aggressive unilateral focus on things like deficits and economic access to the U.S. market. He's labeled or threatened to label Indonesia a currency manipulator. He's withdrawn GSP privileges from Thailand. And of course, he has abandoned Obama's embrace of ASEAN. Trump did attend his first year, 2017, sent Pence in 2018. This year sent a very low-level delegation, which was viewed as a real slap in the face for ASEAN. So we see a backing away from the economic and the multilateral components that were most welcomed in Southeast Asia. We then, as you know, have the declaration of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which in Southeast Asia is viewed very much as a kind of reactionary policy on the part of the U.S. to China, rather than a product of a long-term strategic assessment, right? It's a reaction to maritime assertiveness and concerns that the BRI is less a benevolent investment in aid, development, and infrastructure, and more a tool of economic statecraft for security purposes. So from the Southeast Asian perspective, when they look at these principles in the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, they see freedom of coercion as juxtaposed to the Chinese use of force in the South China Sea. The emphasis on freedom of navigation in contrast to fears that China will impose an anti-access denial strategy there. A rules-based order rather than a might makes right one, and a free trade in contrast to kind of predatory economics and debt trap diplomacy that many believe or argue that the U.S. has. So on the one hand, Southeast Asian states do want some of the principles embodied in the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. They want to see a Southeast Asia free of coercion. The trade-dependent countries in the region do want access to the South China Sea. They do want a rules-based order. But the Southeast Asian countries have been extremely wary of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific for a number of reasons. First, as you all know, and you've heard from both our speakers, national security strategy, the Trump administration labeled China a peer competitor, and the 2018 defense strategy said that China's aim was to dislodge the U.S. from the region. So in the Southeast Asian perspective, the free and open Indo-Pacific is a strategy designed to contain China. And therefore, since it also calls for a building up of alliances and partnerships, they view it as something that will further entrap them in great power competition. Second, the free and open Indo-Pacific was announced almost simultaneously with the reactivation of the Quad, which raised concerns in Southeast Asia that regional autonomy would be sacrificed to these great powers. And for this reason, you see ASEAN feeling compelled to devise its own ASEAN outlook in the Indo-Pacific, which avoids the word free, which China always views as against China, and calls for an inclusive Indo-Pacific region, recognizing that China has a right. So I want to flag that ASEAN has been concerned for those reasons. They've also been concerned about the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy because they don't see it as a strategy. They see it as an articulation of a vision of principles without a concerted set of mechanisms in order to achieve them. Many Southeast Asian countries believe that the free and open Indo-Pacific, the key tool or tactic that has been used are freedom of navigation operations or phone apps. Clearly, the primary U.S. interest in Southeast Asia, or many would argue in the Indo-Pacific, is freedom of navigation of the region's critical sea lanes of communication. And the U.S. asserts its right to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law permits, and it challenges what it views as excessive maritime claims through freedom of navigation exercises, which of course fly, sail, and operate through those things. So here you see a divergence of interest between the U.S., which wants passage through Southeast Asian waterways, and the Southeast Asian interest, which is protection of its maritime territory and protection of its right to exploit resources in its EEZs. And freedom of navigation exercises do nothing to protect those interests. They didn't help the Philippines keep Scarborough Shoal. They haven't helped the Vietnamese or others exploit resources, okay? So as a result of these kinds of perceptions to the Trump administration policy, we see, if we look at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies 2020 survey of Southeast Asian leaderships, that there is real concern on the part of Southeast Asians with the U.S. So 77% stated that U.S. engagement with Southeast Asia has declined under the Trump administration. 52% view China as the region's most influential political and strategic actor. This compares with only 26% for the U.S., and this is a dramatic reversal of only about 5-6 years ago. 80% view China as the region's most significant economic actor, compared to only 8% for the U.S. Southeast Asian countries are certainly worried about China. 85% expressed concern that China will be a revisionist actor as it continues to rise, so that this perception of threat should, in theory, create space for greater engagement on the part of Southeast Asia with the U.S. However, 47% of those surveyed indicate little or no confidence in the ability of the U.S. to uphold its commitments to the region. So they lack confidence of the U.S. as a strategic actor. And finally, when respondents were asked if they had to choose in a hypothetical situation, 7 Southeast Asian countries chose China. Only Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines chose the U.S. So in conclusion, China appears to be winning the competition for influence within Southeast Asia, despite significant worries about China's rise. Clearly, most Southeast Asian states do not want to balance against or bandwagon with China. They really want to hedge their bets, but the strategic space for them to do so is narrowing. So on that note, I'll close there. I recognize I haven't said very much about individual Southeast Asian countries' strategies, but I'm certainly happy to do so in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the three excellent presentations. The floor is now open for questions and discussion. May I ask you to identify yourself and the organization that you represent before you ask your questions? We have Patricia, Mira, and Helen with the microphones. And please, Simon.
I just want you, three of you, to imagine that it's December 2020 and you, I just want you to imagine it's December 2020 and you have been working on the briefing books for the U.S. posture, strategic posture, foreign policy posture in Asia. And I want to know what you would say to A, President Trump, B, President Biden, C, President Sanders, is the biggest risk that they need to address. Thank you.
I love easy questions.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, the first risk, well, this is an interesting hypothetical. I'm going to partly dodge Simon by saying a lot will depend on how the COVID-19 outbreak unfolds, about the state of the global economy at that point. I think from the analysis we've done, the competition with China is an important one because what the US has represented for 60, 70 years is one vision of a global order. That's been relatively inclusive. Other countries are part of it increasingly. You see this when you look at Japan or South Korea or even Indonesia, countries that have democratized since 1945 that now see themselves very much as part of that system. My biggest fear personally is that the United States steps away from that global leadership role because probably very few of us have lived or experienced a world where the United States did not play that role. We know what one of those worlds looked like. The world of the 1920s and 1930s was a period where the global power of the time, Great Britain, was in decline, didn't fully realize it, but stepped back from international leadership. The US was not exerting international leadership. And you saw during a period of economic dislocation the rise of different political models to try and address that, which culminated in a very disruptive war. So I think the biggest challenge facing any of the three hypothetical presidents would be to find a way to maintain a US willingness to exercise effective global leadership.
I would add that, interestingly, when President Obama briefed incoming President Trump on the issues that would define his presidency and the threats that he needed to most focus on, what he warned him foremost about was North Korea. It was an issue that obviously Obama did not tackle in a way that he might have hoped during his 8 years, and he fully recognized that he was handing over quite a thorny problem. And probably not because President Obama warned him about it, but for other various factors, some of them self-serving. The Trump administration paid attention to North Korea, has taken a few stabs at diplomatic efforts, but in the end, we are no closer to any kind of diplomatic solution on denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula than we were 3.5 years ago. And so I think that has to still top the list. And in fact, North Korea has had some time in the interim to continue to develop its capabilities. So we are potentially even in a further dangerous situation that any of the three will have to address. Whether President Trump in a second term would have the appetite for it, given the failures of his initial attempts at diplomacy, is a different question, I think.
No, I'm fine. No, I'm happy to have you call on some votes.
Hello.
I do.
Good evening. I'm Ben. I study Master of Strategic Studies. Just want to firstly thank you for the fantastic event. I have a very broad question, and that is that we are all aware of the Chinese aggression with the South China Sea, an intrusion into the Sea of Japan, and there is a lot of evidences that China has been trying to manipulate into the South Pacific. So would that be fair to say that the world around China is going towards a more maritime forces or creation of these networks to prevent China targeting all these periphery countries and manipulating them in order to expand its policies? And how is that impacting the U.S. policy on China, on the Korean and the Iranian aggression in the region?
I'll make a quick first point and give you some time. So I think that you raised an interesting point about the importance that the maritime domain plays already and will play as we look to hotspots of potential conflict, certainly. It is an area where both the United States and some of its allies and partners are focusing a lot of collective efforts. So in particular, you've seen Japan really begin to put more support in capacity building for smaller states' maritime defenses, which has broken from long-standing policy to provide only economic assistance to the region. The Japan Self-Defense Forces now regularly tour around the Indo-Pacific countries to demonstrate Japanese interests in the region, and have increased their own participation in US-led maritime presence operations, adding ships to offer asset protection for US aircraft carrier task forces. So that's, I think, one example where you're seeing like-mindeds think about how you might collectively address such an issue. And it's something that I think the US certainly should be encouraged to see and find ways to identify opportunities for its allies and partners to add their capabilities to US capabilities and support.
I'll comment a little bit on the South China Sea. I don't think you're seeing any kind of networked response among the Southeast Asian countries, really, or with the US and many Southeast Asian countries outside of maritime capacity building, domain awareness, et cetera, right? If you look at ASEAN, has ASEAN come out in strong support of the Philippines or Vietnam, those countries that have really suffered the brunt of Chinese assertiveness? The answer is no, right? Why not? Because China is now the #1 economic trading partner, investment partner, and ASEAN's consensus decision-making rules essentially give each member a veto over ASEAN policy. That means that countries that China has pretty much bought off, right? Laos, Cambodia, have really done China's bidding within the organization to ensure that it does not take strong stances on the South China Sea, like Vietnam, certainly has wanted, like the Philippines under Aquino pressed for. So we don't see it in ASEAN. You did see a lot of support, right, for the Philippines taking China to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Unfortunately, that ruling in favor of the Philippines came down in July 2016, just weeks after Duterte was inaugurated, and he completely abandoned the plans to use a victory in order to mobilize global support for the ruling and try to compel China, which didn't participate in and has, said it will not abide by it, to try to hold it accountable, right, when there's really no compliance mechanisms in it. So in the absence of the Philippines, when you have Duterte putting it aside, that means that it was really hard for other countries to really use that ruling in the way that they had planned. So on the South China Sea, I think that China's salami slicing strategies and coercive and co-optive statecraft of ASEAN members has really rendered them toothless on the South China Sea.
I'll give you two more thoughts. I think it's a great question. And I think your premise is right. I think we are moving to a world where it's going to be more competitive in the maritime space. From a strategic level, this has always driven US thinking toward the globe, actually. 100 years ago, the US strategists were driven by this idea that the United States would be threatened by the rise of a hostile power that dominated the Eurasian landmass. And so one understanding of why the US got involved in World War I, why the US got involved in World War II, both in the European theater against Nazi Germany and against nationalist Japan in Asia, was to prevent the rise of a hostile power. The same thinking was underpinning, I think, US approaches towards the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So yes, I think from a strategic level, we are moving toward a world of an increased need for maritime power, both surface level and subsurface level, for air power and surveillance capabilities that will be effective in a maritime domain. And increasingly that involves the use of space assets as well. There's an interesting tactical question that comes into play too, and that sort of picks up on what Anne-Marie just said about salami slicing. In the maritime domain, there are very interesting phenomena right now that China's using, especially against Japan around the Senkaku Islands, where Chinese fishing boats or Chinese Coast Guard militias will move into waters that are contested. And so the government of Japan has to figure out, well, how do we respond to this? Do we send our Coast Guard to do this? But if the Chinese militia vessels are essentially outgunning the Japanese Coast Guard, does Tokyo then decide to send in Japanese maritime self-defense forces? That's a real escalation, perceptually, because now you have a navy facing off against non-naval vessels, but those non-naval vessels are capable, and if they fire on Japan, the United States has said it will defend its alliance with Japan, and that alliance does include Japanese administration of the Senkakus. And so it's interesting for governments that are trying to figure out how to respond to these kinds of tactics. When do you deploy your naval assets? When do you use your coast guards? What's the level of interoperability between those surfaces within your own country, let alone interoperability between those surfaces across an alliance? So, yeah, lots of interesting questions in that space.
Can we have the next question, please? And if you could also mention the speaker to which your question is directed at. Thank you.
Hi, Patricia Sexton, MSS candidates. It's actually for any of you. In the banking world, there's a lot of talk about how much the U.S. is at the mercy of China for the exchange rate and the debt imbalance. And I'm wondering how much truth is there to that? I know that the maturities of the debt are spread out over a lot, which reduces over a lot of years, which reduces the risk. But how much is America at risk for their debt imbalance and for the exchange rate?
Okay, sorry, I'll keep talking. Less than you might think, because both sides would lose enormously. If China were to dump, its securities on the market, yes, that would hurt the United States, but it would also hurt China. I think the more interesting thing that we see China doing in the last few years are fairly concerted efforts to diminish the role of the US dollar as sort of the global reserve currency. One of the impacts of the Belt and Road Initiative has been to build out a group of countries around China's periphery and then along those BRI investments and establish essentially trade areas where the renminbi is the currency of choice as opposed to the dollar. Within the worlds of international finance, the US overreacted, I think, to the AIIB when China launched the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, because many of the US allies and partners decided they were going to become part of it. But there are other moves that China is promoting within international finance at more technical levels that challenge this role that the US has enjoyed of being sort of the architect of the global financial framework. And one example would be Beijing's efforts to promote the China International Payment System as an alternative to the SWIFT system. So when we're all trying to move monies around the world from bank to bank, it's SWIFT is the communication system and the transfer system that banks use to move those funds around. China's trying to promote an alternative. And the more that takes root and gives countries options outside the US-led system, it limits the ability of the United States to use economic tools to put leverage on adversaries. So I dodged your question about Iran earlier, but a scenario a decade or so from now might be that if Iran were fully in this CIPS framework, US financial sanctions on Iran would be useless because Iran would have alternatives to get currency into the country. And that's a challenge for US policymakers because if you take away the economic tools, what are you left with, and does that incline you more towards using tools of force?
Hello, I'm James Toe from the Asia New Zealand Foundation. I've got a question maybe for Anne-Marie, but also for others on the panel as well. A couple of weeks ago, President Duterte had stepped away from the Visiting Forces Agreement, while Trump sort of shrugged it off and saying, oh, that's actually a good thing because it's going to save the US a bit of money. For US defense officials, they were saying it was a step in the wrong direction. So my question is about red lines, and what are some of the red lines that might signal to the US that it is losing influence in the region, and maybe your thoughts on Huawei and whether that is a red line? Thank you.
Whoa, I'm sorry. Interesting question. It's always so hard with Duterte, right? I mean, he says so many things, and many of the things he says are contradicted by others in the defense community, and particularly in the Philippine Armed Forces, right? So if you were to survey most of the top military brass, they want no changes at all in either the Visiting Forces Agreement or the EDSA Agreement or the Mutual Defense Agreement, right? And although it's the Visiting Force Agreement that, kind of allows for quick responses, particularly of the type that we saw in Mindanao after the Marawi riots, if he really goes forward, with that, or started toying with the two other things, those would be even more significant. So is that a red line? I'm not sure, right? Because many believe that if Duterte were to depart the scene, you would see a quick reversal of that. And I think it's one of the reasons I think that we've seen such a tilt towards China in Southeast Asia is that there's really hard to find red lines, right? That's why Chinese salami slicing was so effective, right? Everything was small. Nothing was sufficiently important to dictate a stand, but cumulatively, over time, China changed the facts on the ground, right? And here, just from the US perspective, you know, I think it's important to remember that when Xi Jinping was in DC in 2015, he promised Obama, oh, we would never militarize those islands. And so when Michael talks about that sea change in DC thinking, I think it's hard, at least particularly for the folks that get out in Indo-PACOM, to overestimate how important that was, particularly on the maritime side. I'll just say that on Huawei, you see a range of views, right? So Thailand has a Huawei Academy. They're pretty much all in. Vietnam is certainly opposing it. And the fact of the matter is that there's not a really good American alternative, right? So there was a survey of Southeast Asian leaders on the 5G question, and their preferred provider was Samsung, okay? But that's gonna be more expensive and compatible with certain things. So you're gonna see a very disparate response. And I will just say one other thing. You brought up the Philippines. Clearly, the other formal ally in Southeast Asia is Thailand. We see Thailand contracting with China for 3 submarines, in part because they were so much cheaper. They could get 3 for the price of 1 South Korean submarine. And what do we see now? That China wants to station a maintenance crew and have the submarines based at Sadahip, a critical naval base U.S. built during the Vietnam War, that if you read the 2008 defense strategy, it says that access to Sadahip is critically important to U.S. power projection capacity. And yet, if you have Chinese folks, military officials at Sadahip, that is going to have implications for the ability of the U.S. Navy to use it. Is that a red line? Not exactly, but it's a real critical juncture, all right? And so I think that what we need to look at in Southeast Asia, U.S., are these series of critical decisions that are path dependent, that foreclose future operating and relationship issues.
I would add, I completely concur with Anne-Marie's point that red lines are really difficult to identify in this case because it has been a lot of slow-moving, difficult to identify as clearly challenging activity on the part of China. But your question is interesting from another perspective, that it assumes that the United States, and in particular the Trump administration, cares about losing influence in this specific way. I think that in a kind of traditional US presidency, you could ask that question with a little more clarity, but that the behaviors that Trump has shown to allies and partners in the region have not inspired a lot of confidence that he does really care about these types of responses. You know, the administration has not shown a lot of distinction in how it differentiates treatment of allies versus treatment of rivals, especially when it comes to trade issues. And that's certainly a theme that allies and partners have picked up on and are responding to. And again, Duterte may be a kind of a odd case, but there are plenty of others in the region that have expressed similar concerns that, you know, if we don't understand, we're an ally and you're treating us with, you know, punishing tariffs and really harsh negotiations like you would somebody that you don't have a security agreement with. And so that itself is causing other frictions in bilateral relationships. So I think the question of losing regional influence is a little bit self-inflicted in this case.
I'm going to take advantage of my position as the chair and ask the next question. Perhaps for Mike. Mike, you mentioned that the US and China are in an enduring competition, and from some of the other remarks, about the critical junctures and so on, it seems like the US and China are structurally locked in this intense rivalry, which will intensify further. So I was wondering, have we gone past the point of no return? And can the US and China mutually accommodate each other? What might this mutual accommodation look like? Perhaps if not to end the rivalry, to at least, de-escalate it.
I think, and our colleague Ashley Tellis makes this point in the most recent Strategic Asia book, the competition was not inevitable. But I think as China emerged and began to act like a traditional great power, and as the assertion of its interests challenged core US interests, we did become locked into a competitive relationship. I don't personally subscribe to the view that there's some kind of accommodation to be made, that you can't think of, we're not in a situation like we were in the beginning of the Cold War. In 1945 to the early 1950s, the West, as it was emerging and recovering from World War II, really had no economic linkages with the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. And so the struggle was easy from a conceptual level. You have two rival power blocs that each occupy different geographies around the world, with different ideological systems underpinning them, and both understood that they were locked into a long-term competition, and so national security managers were figuring out how to prevail for their side in that struggle. I think that for many administrations over the last 20 plus years, there's been a hope that as China grew in power, it would emerge and behave in ways that other states have done. Japan and Germany both emerged and really focused on being trading powers. They did not try to recapture the sort of the great powers that they were striving to be during the 1920s and 1930s. China appears to have chosen a different course, and so I think it is now a structural challenge. The management of that then is what really is focusing minds both in Washington and I presume in Beijing. Because if you accept the argument that I've just made, but you acknowledge that there's an economic interdependence between the United States and China, you can't use the same playbook that you used during the Cold War. So we're in uncharted territory. We're really trying to figure out how to manage a competitive international environment in ways that maintain global peace, because any kind of war between the United States and China would be incredibly devastating. And so, again, I'm going to credit Ashley Tellis with this because it's not my idea or my insight. But the two biggest losers in this rivalry, if it's not managed well, will actually be the United States and China.
We have time for one last question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Alex Fabella. I'm a Victoria student. So my question was, and this is for anyone, how do you find the supply shortages being resolved? Like, do you think these states will begin producing domestically, or somebody else will fill in this absent role? Supply shortages?
Supply of what?
Just in general, like what
Are you
China
talking
is
about the economic
exporting.
decoupling? Are you talking about supply shortages as a result of economic decoupling?
Yes, on behalf of China.
So will economic decoupling mean that manufacturing will go back to the US or elsewhere? How will the economic architecture change as a result of economic decoupling?
I'll let my colleagues talk a little bit about the US. I will say that if you look at the impact of, say, the U.S.-China trade war, certain Southeast Asian countries have benefited from that, right? because once you have tariffs on Chinese manufacturers, even Chinese companies, there was a great study done by the World Bank, are seeking to access U.S. market. Vietnam was the preferred country. They looked at 33 companies. The majority went to Vietnam. If you went to Malaysia, none went to Indonesia. So you do see certain Southeast Asian countries benefiting from decoupling. Now, that's just one aspect. If you have a further decoupling, I think it's really going to harm many, many countries.
Yeah, I think two examples on sort of decoupling as a phenomenon that's already taking place. For a lot of Japanese companies, after the Japanese government nationalized the Senkaku Islands in a way to try and avoid it being a political problem between Japan and China in 2012, and then there was a series of very strong protests against Japan and you know, vandalism against Japanese facilities in China, Japanese corporate boards were beginning to look more broadly at parts of Southeast Asia as places to establish their manufacturing sites. Partly driven as well, so politics was part of it was just pure economics. As China has got richer, labor costs within China have risen, and increasingly it's more cost effective if you're a major multinational company to look at producing in parts of developing Southeast Asia where the cost of production is lower. Two phenomena since then, I think, have really accelerated that trend. And the first was driven by the Trump administration's trade policy. The uncertainties that flow from the sort of imposition of tariffs against China were a major concern for lots of businesses, because they literally didn't know from day to day or week to week what kinds of tariffs they would be facing, when they would be put in place, what products they would cover. And just again, that once you get into a trade war and both sides have the ability to use that as a tool, you create an enormous amount of uncertainty that for businesses is really problematic. And so a lot of them were beginning to realize that their supply chains were perhaps too dependent on China because they were beginning to suffer in the trade war and they were starting to look for alternatives to that. The COVID-19 outbreak, I think, is now only going to accelerate that trend, because I think it will encourage companies to take a hard look at their supply chains to the extent that they can. It will encourage governments to take a hard look at where some of their core resources come from, whether those are energy or food. I mean, the fundamental things that you need to make sure that you can satisfy the needs of your population. And again, this sort of echoes sort of part of what I think, Manjeet, you were saying. We're moving into new territory that we haven't seen before, where the globalized world that we've been living in for the last 30 plus years may be starting to shift and evolve in ways that are sort of new for us. And I think, you know, we all, as citizens of various countries, as companies and as governments, are trying to navigate what that means.
Thank you very much. Otherwise, I would like to formally bring the panel to an end. If you could join me in thanking our speakers. This has been an excellent and fascinating panel over the day, so thank you for that. There is opportunity to continue these discussions more informally outside, where refreshments and drinks are served. Thank you very much.